Yeah, so I think I'm recording now. Can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. So, yeah, hello everyone. I'm Rob van Eynde. I'm originally from Belgium. I did a PhD in operations research and then started a postdoc with Federico de Maria and Dan O'Neill at the University of Barcelona. And today I will be presenting on our work that we are doing on ecological macroeconomic modeling. And more specifically, I'm going to talk about two topics. First of all, how to model post-growth scenarios, and then also about how to include social and environmental indicators in macroeconomic models. So the work that I'm presenting is not only my work, it's work that has been done by many people. And I will give more credit when we talk about the two subparts. But in general, it's based at the University of Barcelona, and we're funded by two European research projects, which are called MAPS and To Be. And so MAPS is coordinated by Federico de Maria and Dan O'Neill, and in the other one, our team is one of the collaborators. So I will first, in the first half of my talk, approximately, I will discuss modeling post-growth scenarios, and then I will talk in the second part about the compass model, which is the model that we've just finished, or at least finished the first version of. So the first part I've been working on together with Kevin Dillman, Yefim Vogel, and Dan O'Neill. Hi, John. So why talk about modeling post-growth scenarios? Well, there's a lot of upcoming talk about having better inclusion of post-growth scenarios in modeling literature. So, for instance, there are these Kaiser and Lenzen in 2021. They argued that degrowth or post-growth pathways exhibit lower risks in terms of feasibility and sustainability compared to typical pathways or scenarios that are used in IEM modeling, in integrated assessment modeling. Um, and also Hickel et al., they argue that post-growth scenarios, which are socially and politically ambitious, should be included next to scenarios that mainly focus on technological improvement. So the main argument is we need to rethink how our societies operate, and existing scenarios don't really question some of the embedded assumptions in our socioeconomic systems. And they mainly focus on how can we technologically improve, but they don't really assess what are other changes that we could make to improve well-being and sustainability at the same time. So next to like various calls in the literature, there's also an increase in research, modeling research related to degrowth or postgrowth. So here on the right, you see some research done by Laura et al. In systematic literature review, which maps how many studies have been, modeling studies have been done each year on either degrowth or postgrowth or something of both. And you see that since 2020, there has been a sharp increase per year. So it's not only that people are calling for better work, researchers have started responding to these calls and started modeling post-growth and degrowth pathways more. And then another indication of that there's growing attention for this is that there's various projects. Here I'm listing 5, which are funded by European money, European research money, that are at least partially addressing modeling of post-growth scenarios in some way. So it's clear that this is an upcoming topic which is receiving more and more attention. And so we are also building a model, the Compass model, to simulate post-growth scenarios. But during this work, we also asked ourselves the question, how can we model post-growth and post-growth scenarios in a good way? It seems like a simple question, but the reply to that is not very easy, I would say, because you can come up with a whole list of criteria, but if you have too many criteria, it becomes a very difficult list to satisfy. But at the same time, if you don't put enough criteria, you might also be misrepresenting what post-growth is about. So it's a difficult balancing act. I would say. And so what we've done for this part of the research is we first came up with a definition of what do we understand about as post-growth. And then we designed a survey. We contacted a lot of modeling people in the post-growth space, and we asked them their opinions. And so I will talk about that a little bit and also about then the results from this survey. So first of all, what do I mean with post-growth? For me, it's different than degrowth. Some people use post-growth and degrowth as in interchangeable terms, but for us, they mean different things. Namely, post-growth we treat as an umbrella concept that captures different sustainability narratives that have certain things in common. Namely, they prioritize three goals, namely achievement of well-being, equity, and sustainability, and they are critical of economic growth as a goal by itself. Um, some of these narratives are very critical of economic growth, such as degrowth, while others are more agnostic. But what they share is that they don't think economic growth should be a goal for its own sake. At most, it can be instrumental for achieving well-being, equity, and sustainability. And so, donut economics, degrowth are examples of post-growth narratives, while the Sustainable Development Goals, although it includes goals for well-being, equity, and sustainability, it also has economic growth as an explicit goal. So we wouldn't label it as a post-growth narrative. And so based on this definition, then we got interested in like what elements should be included in a model, in a macroeconomic model, to be able to model post-growth goals or outcomes in a good way. And also what elements should be included to model specific policy teams or transition strategies. So I'll first walk you a little bit through the methods. We started by identifying a list of policy teams that is recurring in post-growth literature. And then also we identified a list of model elements that could be relevant to include in a model. And starting from these two lists, we created a survey. We contacted about 200 people. All these people either have published work on modeling post-growth scenarios, or they are part of the post-growth modeling community, which is a community that was founded last year. And so in total, our list was about 200 people long, and 38 people responded. And so based on these responses, we then created results and started analyzing the data. So before I go to the results, I want to talk a little bit about how we created the policy teams and the model elements. So for the policy teams, we base ourselves mainly on three studies, which you can see at the bottom of the slide. And each of them talks about different policies or policy teams that are relevant within degrowth and post-growth literature. But what we found is that there's actually a very large overlap between these studies. And so from the perspective of modeling, you can group the proposed policies in 8 broad themes. The first one being the promotion of well-being and need satisfaction. And so specific policies that would fall under this category can be universal basic services or affordable housing schemes, for instance. Then the second theme is reducing inequality. And so this can be done, for instance, through policies like universal basic income, stronger wealth taxation, and so on. And I won't be explaining examples for each of the groups, but they will appear on the slides. So the third category is reducing impact on Earth systems. So in general, how do we improve the sustainability of our societies? How do we reduce environmental pressures? Then the fourth category is changing consumption patterns. So how can we shift towards more essential consumption, reduce unnecessary consumption? And the flip side of the same coin is changing production patterns. So how can the productive capacity of our economies be changed and refocused so that it's focused more on the goals of post-growth and less on, for instance, profit accumulation. And then there's transforming the financial system. After the financial crisis, I think a lot of people understood that there are big issues with how the system is working now. And so also within post-growth literature, there is a call for redirecting the system to be more in line with the goals again of achieving better well-being and sustainability. Then there's also the seventh theme, rethinking international relations. There is a strong decolonial aspect or a component in post-growth literature which talks about unequal exchange between the global north and the global south, which challenges these unequal dynamics. And so part of the policy proposals are focused on creating more equal relationships between different parts of the world. And then the last policy team is transforming work. So this talks about how can we reduce the amount of paid labor that people do while still maintaining their income? How can we redefine the concept of work so that unpaid care work, for instance, is also seen as work? And so that there's a more equalization of different types of work and not only a focus on purely monetary or monetized work. So these 8 broad themes, I'm going to try to restructure them a little bit. If we think again about the 3 goals that I discussed before, so the 3 goals for post-growth are achieving well-being, equity, and sustainability, then you might have seen that in the policy themes that I introduced, 3 of them kind of directly map to these goals. So these 3 themes that you see here almost have a one-to-one mapping on the goals that we outlined in the beginning. Then the other 5 themes I would call strategies, as they don't necessarily directly aim at improving well-being or equity or sustainability, but they start from an understanding of our socioeconomic systems that is rooted in post-growth literature, and it has the end goal of achieving post-growth goals, and it tries to do that by proposing changes to the current system. So I would treat these as strategies that are instrumental to achieving the policy goals. Then for the second part on the model elements, so here we again looked at literature, mainly post-growth literature, to see what are things that are treated as important, that are seen as important to consider. And based on this, we also made 8 categories of model elements. The first one considers need satisfaction. So what there should be parts in the model or variables in the model that represent, for instance, the achievement of material needs or non-material needs, and so on. Then the second part is the biophysical sphere. So there's a strong call for representing the biosphere or linking it to economic systems, which also comes, for instance, from steady-state economy. And so there are several variables that we propose that could capture this. Then there's modes of provisioning. So how are goods and services being produced? Is it for profit? Is it the government that produces them? Is it in communities, like through non-institutional means? The fourth category is international interactions. So trade relations between parts of the world, both in monetary terms and biophysical terms. Then we have the households. So this is in most macroeconomic models, this is a typical agent. But then drawing on post-growth literature, what are some of the things that are important to include there? Can be, for instance, disaggregation, or how do households make consumption decisions? Also, firms are important to represent. But then again, we think about what kind of elements in firm decision-making are relevant for post-growth scenarios. Then we have the government. And then as a last block, we have the financial sector and central bank. So these are the 8 broad groups within the specific elements. And then with this, we created a survey. So in the first part of the survey, we just asked about the general expertise of the respondents in terms of modeling and their expertise in post-growth literature. And then the main gist of the survey followed this kind of structure. So it's essentially a big table where each column represents one of the 8 policy themes that I introduced, and each row in the table represents one of the elements that I also discussed before. And so the question is, for each specific theme, which model elements are essential to include? We specifically asked them to really focus on the essential things, because of course you could say each element is important, but yeah, we really asked them to focus on what are the main or the most important elements. And then as a last thing, we also asked some general thoughts at the end, or also some feedback. And we asked if there were elements missing in our survey to also validate whether we captured the most important things. And so now let's talk a little bit about the results. First of all, about the respondents. Here you can see a bit more information about their years of experience. So the respondents had between 0 and 35 years of experience the majority had between 0 and 10 years of experience, which reflects that this kind of research has only been growing quite significantly in the last 10 years. But then at the same time, we see some people that have, yeah, quite some people who have more than 10 years of experience. So it's also nice to see that we have some more experienced people. Then in terms of how they rate rank their expertise, we see that it's quite equally distributed from absolutely no experience to experts. And then we also asked about like their experience in the specific policy teams, but I won't discuss that much more in detail. So then about the results for the link between policy teams and elements, you can see this table on the right. It's maybe a bit much of information, but each column here represents a policy team, and then the rows again have the elements. And so when a cell is blue, it indicates that there's a significant agreement between respondents that this element should be included. So for instance, on the top left, you see that to promote well-being and need satisfaction, you should have an element which represents material needs in your model, which is not that surprising, of course. But you also see the shade of the blue indicates how high the agreement is. So the darker blue means a higher degree of agreement. It's quite a bit of information in this table, so I'm going to focus on the three policy teams that are addressing the goals, so well-being, equity, and sustainability. Because I think if we want to model post-growth scenarios, we should be able to assess them in terms of these three goals. And therefore, models that want to include or that want to represent post-growth scenarios should include these elements that are essential. And so this is the subset of the previous table, but I also created some kind of conceptual framework based on this to give it a bit more tangible, or like to make it a bit more tangible. And so if a model would represent our society, it should represent three main blocks: the biophysical system, the socioeconomic system, and then social outcomes. And so what comes out of this survey as the essential elements is that on the biophysical side, a model should include resource flows, energy flows, and also embodied resources in trade. And these flow into the socioeconomic system. There might be limits to specific resources that go into the economy. And then at the same time, there's also anthropogenic impact on ecosystems. So there's pollution, there's waste that's being generated, which has effects on the biosphere. Then in the socioeconomic system for households, what is important to include is some kind of disaggregation between different types of households so that we're able to capture inequality. And then also important are to represent wealth, income, and time use for households. On the firm side, what is important is to model how technological change happens. This is mainly because there's a lot of debate about decoupling rates. So if economies are able to decouple resource use and pollution faster from economic output, it means that we can move within planetary boundaries faster or reduce our ecological pressures faster. But in many of the mainstream scenarios, these decoupling rates are very ambitious. And so this has been critiqued by post-growth and degrowth researchers. So I think this is an important point here, is that technological change is modeled in a cautious way without having too ambitious decoupling rates. And related to that is the resource and pollution intensity. So how much resources are used to generate or to create certain goods and services. Then on the government side, it seems that various policies or types of interventions are important. So the government should be able to impose some kind of redistribution policy, possibly price controls on essential goods. It's important that the government can provide essential goods also itself, so producing the goods themselves, and also to enforce environmental protection. So these are four policy levers that are important that came out of this survey. And then the activity in the socioeconomic system has an effect on social outcomes. So material and non-material needs should be included, where material needs might be linked to specific goods produced in the economy, and non-material needs might be a bit trickier to link to the socioeconomic system. And then a last point that's important here is the affordability of decent living standards. So because we are living in monetized economies, people are able to access basic goods with money. And so prices and how much goods you're able to buy with a certain amount of money is important to assess whether people can satisfy their basic needs or not. So this is the general picture, where I would say I don't think there's any model that captures all of these things at the moment. Modeling in general or macroeconomic modeling is a tricky endeavor. So it's not necessarily to critique existing models, it's more to put forward some kind of research agenda or ideal state for if we want to model post-growth scenarios well, this is what we should be working towards. So it's more like an agenda with ideas to improve existing models. And so to wrap up this part, to assess scenarios in line with post-growth goals, what we propose to minimally consider is the following things. So on the biophysical sphere, there should be material flows in biophysical units. Materials and energy should be seen as factors of production. And the model should also represent anthropogenic impacts on ecosystems. Then in the socioeconomic sphere, there should at least be some kind of representation of inequality, should be cautious about decoupling rates, and there should be different ways that the government can intervene. And then on the social outcomes, both material and non-material needs should be represented, and the affordability of decent living standards should be considered. So this is the conclusion of the first part of my presentation. Now we'll move to the second part about the macroeconomic model that we're building, ecological macroeconomic model, where we're trying to apply as many of the insights that we've gathered from the first part of this presentation. So we're aiming to include as many of these things as possible. But again, it's also an endeavor that takes a long time. And as you can see here in the list of collaborators at the bottom, we have been working on this model for the past year with quite a lot of people. So the COMPASS model, it's an acronym for, as you can see below, the Comprehensive Open Source Macroeconomic Model for Planetary and Social Sustainability. So we're basing this model on the idea of donut economics, which was introduced by Kate Raworth in her book Donut Economics, where sustainability is conceptualized as a donut with two rings, and the inner ring represents the social foundation, so essential or basic needs that each person on the planet should be able to satisfy, while at the same time respecting the ecological ceiling. So we shouldn't be pressuring our ecosystems beyond a certain degree where we are threatening our own survival in the long term or of future generations. So this is the basic idea, and this is what we took as a starting point for our model. So as a conceptual basis for our model, we wanted to be able to explicitly model a diverse set of environmental and social outcomes, drawing on the idea of the donut. It's a system dynamics model, so it's not a general equilibrium model, which is what most of the mainstream economics models are. It allows for system dynamics works with differential equations, and so it allows for different types of dynamics, and it doesn't assume that for instance, households or firms are rational optimizing agents. The model also includes an input-output structure, so it has different sectors in the economy, and we don't only capture the production of final goods, but also intermediate goods that flow between the sectors. It's a post-Keynesian model, so it's driven by demand, and money is also endogenously created in the model. And last, it's stock flow consistent, so every flow of money needs to have some origin and also some destination. So it's not allowed that money comes out of nowhere and disappears without having any accounting of that. In general, it's also an open source model. So we're building this in the programming language Julia. And at the moment, it's not the model is not public yet because we're still in the development of it. But the idea is that once it's finished, we will release this with all the code publicly available so that everybody can look at the code, look at the documentation, because we think it's very important that models become accessible to everybody who wants to try to understand them. So I'm now going to show you a picture with a general overview of the compass model. It looks like this. It seems pretty complicated with a lot of arrows and boxes. So for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to simplify it a little bit into 4 neat boxes. So we have basically 4 main modules in our model at the moment. There's the economy model module at the center, which has an effect on the other 3 modules. Then on the left, you see the sustainability module, which has some feedback effects onto demographics and also onto the economy. There's a demographics module, which calculates population dynamics, which then have an effect on the economy through labor force. And then there's the well-being module, where some parts of the economy or economic activity have an effect on well-being, but also there are internal links between certain parts of the well-being module. So I'll now walk you through each of the 4 modules step by step to highlight what are the main dynamics in our model. So for the economy, the first agent that we have are firms. So firms, they have expectations about what the demand will be for their production in the next period. And that is what they produce. And at the same time, they will also invest in new productive capital to reach a certain capacity utilization. They also trade with the rest of the world. So we treat the rest of the world as one abstract country, let's say, but we model this in a very simplified way because it's not the main focus of our model. And at the moment, we have 6 sectors in the model, mainly linked to essential sectors, so education, energy production, food production, healthcare, transportation, and then other sectors which captures all the other parts of the economy. Firms produce final goods and intermediate goods, and the other sectors also produce capital goods, which are bought by all the sectors. Then there's the government. Government, first of all, demands final goods from the firms. It also collects taxes and social contributions, which is both for firms and from individuals. And then it distributes social transfers. So it provides unemployment benefits, pension benefits, and other social benefits for individuals. And then last, for the government, it's also the space where policy intervention happens. And then we have the households, the third main agent in our economy block. At the moment, we split the households in 30 subclasses. So we split households into sex, 3 skill levels, and 5 employment statuses, which leads to 30 subgroups of households. And then this allows us to capture inequality. Households consume final goods from firms. They also provide labor to firms and receive wages in return. And they are the unit of analysis for many of our social outcomes. Then for the sustainability module, we capture different types of materials and pollution, but the logic is the same for all of them. So I'm going to show you the general logic, which starts from economic production. So firms decide how much are we going to produce in a certain period, and then this leads to a certain amount of resource use and also pollution generated by this production. Then we do a sustainability assessment where we compare for different types of resources and pollution. We compare the amount of pollution to planetary boundaries. So it's a national model, so we're doing this at the moment for Spain. So then we look at what is the remaining CO2 or carbon budget for Spain, and we look at how much CO2 is Spain emitting in a year. And like this, we can compare and see whether Spain is respecting its downscale planetary boundaries for the ones that you see here. So CO2 emissions, nitrogen and phosphorus use, blue water consumption, and material use. Then, based on the resource use and pollution, we also model some kind of environmental change, which includes climate change, but also, for instance, PM 2.5 pollution. And this can have feedback mechanisms or feedback effects onto economic production and also on the demographics module, which I'll come back to in a little bit. Then there's the well-being side. So here we have a lot of different social indicators, and I would group them in two blocks. The first block are those that can be linked to one of our economic sectors. So here again, you have the sectors that we are modeling at the moment. And at the right-hand side, you see the social indicators that are kind of one-on-one mapping to each of these sectors. So as an example, life expectancy, we have various things that affect life expectancy in the model, but one of them is the amount of people working in the healthcare sector. So the employment in the healthcare sector has a positive effect on life expectancy. For others like nutrition or education, the representation is a bit more simple, and it's mainly the total production in the food sector that affects nutrition, and there's not a lot of other drivers. So we have these six that map to the specific economic sectors. And then the second cluster of social indicators don't link to specific sectors, but some of those still link to general macroeconomic dynamics, which are job availability, income adequacy, gender equality, and income fairness. And each of these, like I think in most macroeconomic models, you would be able to calculate these indicators because they're linked to either to employment or to income. But then we also have other indicators, such as social support, which depends on some of our other social indicators, such as job availability and income fairness, and also has some exogenous drivers that we include, but we treat them as a constant or a constant trend over time. Then there's life satisfaction, which is driven by social support, life expectancy, and again, also some exogenous drivers, and the same for democratic quality. And then the last module in our model, the demographics module, calculates population dynamics. At the moment, we have 8 cohorts. So we split the total population in 4 age groups and then 2 sexes. And the population dynamics are driven by fertility, mortality, and migration rates. Fertility and migration we treat as parameters, so you can change the values for fertility and migration in the future to see what would the effect be of a higher migration rate, for instance. But these are not determined in the model itself. And then we have mortality rates. This is endogenously calculated in the model. And so some of the factors that are affecting mortality rates are coming from the sustainability module, for instance, PM2.5 emissions, but also extreme heat events, which might increase mortality and are dependent on climate change. And then there's also working hours from the economy module. So a higher number of working hours per week leads to a higher risk for stroke and heart disease, which then would increase mortality rates, which then allows us to model, for instance, the effect of a working time reduction policy on mortality rates. So this model, we just have finished like a first report on the documentation of this model, but there's still a lot of things that we need to iron out. But we already are thinking about what are things that we can do with this model. The first and the most obvious one is to evaluate policy packages in terms of social and environmental outcomes instead of purely economic outcomes. Then a second possible application is to simulate goal-seeking scenarios. So at the moment, Spain, for instance, is not within the donut. So then we can simulate what would be required for Spain to move within the donut. So what kind of consumption reductions would be necessary, what kind of decoupling rates, what kind of social policies would be relevant. So it allows us to simulate different options of reaching the donut. And then the last option we see at the moment is to explore trade-offs between goals. I think a good example here is the Nitrogen Act that was introduced by the European Commission a while ago, where there is stricter regulation on the amount of nitrogen pollution that can be emitted by farmers. But this has had severe backlash because this was threatening the livelihoods of farmers. So there is often a trade-off between social and environmental goals, and our model, at least in theory, should be able to explore these trade-offs. So to wrap up this part of the presentation, I'm going to give you a small showcase of what we can do with the model already. So I'm going to show you two scenarios. The first one is a business as usual, where we're basically extrapolating past trends into the future in terms of consumption, decoupling, and so on. And then there's a social policy scenario, which combines three policies: a work time reduction of 15%, increased progressive taxation, and a minimum income guarantee. And I'm first going to show you what it means, what the effect would be on GDP per capita. So here you see that for the social policy scenario, the orange line, once the policies get introduced, GDP per capita drops quite a bit, and then it recovers, but it stays at a lower level than in the business as usual case, which, like, if you would purely evaluate the policies in terms of GDP per capita, you would not be very fond of this proposal. But then to showcase the power of our model, what would it mean in terms of the donut? So this is how Spain is doing in 2020. So the start year of our model at the moment. What you see is that Spain is overshooting the planetary boundaries for phosphorus and nitrogen, and also slightly for material footprints. And on the social side, what you see in the blue wedges inside of the donut is that it's falling short on some of its social goals, namely I think the main ones are income fairness, job availability, and income access. So if everything would be blue in the center, we would be meeting all social goals. And if there would be no red wedges outside of the ecological ceiling, we would be respecting all ecological ceilings or all planetary boundaries. So I keep this picture on the left-hand side and at the bottom at the top as a reference point. So what's the situation in 2050? For business as usual, we see that the overshoot on planetary boundaries for nitrogen and phosphorus improves, and also for material footprints, but for CO2 emissions, it gets worse. And then on the social side, we see income fairness, job availability, and income adequacy are almost as worse or a little worse than before. And then also we see that social support and life satisfaction have also decreased over time. And now to compare with the social policies scenario, first of all, on the social side, we see that there's already a big improvement, again, on these three indicators: income fairness, job availability, and income adequacy. And there's also a slight improvement in social support, for instance, compared to the business as usual case. So in social terms, the social policies are desirable. And then also on the environmental side, it's very small. I don't think you will be able to really see it here, but the overshoot is slightly lower than in the business as usual case because of a reduction in GDP per capita. So the total output is reduced, so also the total environmental pressure is reduced, which I think is a very interesting showcase of our model. If you would evaluate this kind of social policy scenario purely in economic terms, in GDP per capita, it would not be very desirable. But here, with this model, we are able to demonstrate that it actually has benefits both on social and environmental side. Yeah, and here I will wrap up my presentation. Thanks for staying with me to the end, and I'm very happy to discuss or hear feedback on this as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob. I really appreciate you, first of all, doing the presentation and then making alternative arrangements because kind of embarrassing I couldn't get through. So thank you so much for doing this. If anybody's have any questions, go ahead or comments, please go ahead and ask.
Is it okay?
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's really, really interesting to see, and it's great that there are these kind of models that you're working on to kind of counter some of the other models that are out there and have a little bit more information. I was wondering in terms of the inequality aspect, because for the demographics you presented that there's like you're breaking it up into the four age groups and then two sexes. Of course, a lot of inequality is also based on other elements. So, I mean, you have a probably income in some way, maybe you have represented there as well, but also in terms of race, and then you also have like disability, like there are a lot of factors that play into that. I don't know. I mean, I realize it's a macroeconomic model, so you can't go maybe into all the detail that something else might be able to do, but is there something that you could do in that respect, or that you see maybe that could be done in the future? I'm just curious because that's an area that I'm interested in and thinking.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's something when I started this work on this project, we did a review of existing models on how well they performed in terms of representing social outcomes and environmental indicators. And there we came to the same conclusion, like gender inequality is pretty well captured by most of these models, but then other dimensions or like a more intersectional perspective on inequality is often lacking. I think the main issue is data availability. So the data sets that we are using, we have data that is split along sex and skill level. So this in a way could capture a class, for instance, or you could see it as we're representing that dimension. But then, yeah, race and other dimensions are missing. And it's yeah, you could build theoretical models, I think, where you try to show or like capture some of the things that are coming from empirical research about inequalities. But for the kind of model that we are building, where we're actually trying to represent an actual economy or an actual society, yeah, we need to work with the data that we have. And so I think this is a big shortcoming but I think this is a big research line in itself. Making sure that this data is available, yeah, requires a lot of work from statistical agencies. And yeah, I'm quite frustrated that we cannot do it. But at the same time, also, I think indeed in a macroeconomic model, you can capture some dynamics of inequality, but then from an intersectional perspective as well, inequalities really depend on how different dimensions of your identity or different axes of oppression are intersecting. And I think that a macroeconomic model is in general not very capable of representing that, except maybe in like employment, how people are spending time in specific sectors, or we are also thinking about including care work, for instance, or representing time use in a way. So you could try to capture some of these dynamics, but at the same time, yeah, I think other approaches might also be uh, more suited for simulating or like understanding these dynamics. Yeah, I hope that answers your question a bit.
Yes, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I have to leave now, but it was
Mhm.
great to see your presentation.
Are there any other questions?
I'll hop in next. So a couple of quick questions. The first is about that last slide you had up. The donut model graphics are amazing. And I was curious, the social policies one actually didn't really look better in terms of like the upper bound
Mhm.
sustainability aspects. It kind of looks the same. I think
Yeah,
you said that it was better, so maybe it's
it's
so I wonder if you have any comments about that.
you can see like the difference here is the difference between the GDP per capita in business as usual and social policies, which is going from, I don't know, 27,000 something to 29,000. So it's not a very big difference. And then on these plots, you don't really see the difference. So I don't think like the social policies, that's not the focus that the environmental side would improve. But I just found it an interesting point that even though these policies are focused on the social side, they still have a small effect on the environmental side. But if we would really want to simulate like improvements on the environmental side, we would also have to implement more policies that are focused on reducing emissions or reducing pollution and so on. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you. And then my other just super quick question is about one of your first slides, showing the increase in publications, like post-growth and
Mhm.
degrowth publications. And that's amazing to see, really exciting. And I'm wondering if you got that from like some database that's publicly available, or if you could share that maybe.
Yeah, It's a review by Laura et al. In 2025. I typed it in just in the chat, but I don't know by heart the full. If you want, I can quickly look it up. But there
Oh,
have
that's
been
okay. I could
a
look it
f-
up too.
there have been a few reviews in the recent years. I think recently one in ecological economics as well about post-growth modeling. So if you look on Google Scholar, I think you will easily or quickly find some as well. So
Great.
here's the link to the one that I've been referencing.
Thank you. Also have to
Yeah.
hop off, but I really appreciate this great work.
Thanks.
Hi, Rob.
Anyone else?
Welcome. Yeah, welcome. Sorry, I raised my hand. Thank you for the presentation. Really nice to see these models like coming to reality in a sense. So one of the questions that I was wondering about, because you mentioned about international trade, that is like